Hi everyone, Daljeet Peterson here with astrolab21.com, and welcome back to our continuing series, Blueprint of the Soul, where we're learning to become the architect of our own destiny by learning to read our astrological birth chart. So now we're 8 episodes in here, so hopefully if you've been following along with this whole series, you're really starting to get some value out of this. It's all starting to coalesce. Some of these topics, these principles that we've been exploring are starting to cohere for you in a way that's sort of locking and hooking up, right? It's really connecting. You're connecting some of these dots. And of course, I've been soliciting, comments from you guys out there. Really like to know, get some feedback on how these things are working for you, if it's making sense, what's working, what's not. Some of you have generously shared your comments and greatly appreciate that feedback, but always looking for more. It really helps me to hone and refine and really work on the direction that this series is taking. So if you do that, of course, always the solicitation to like and subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell as well. One other bit of housekeeping I want to do before we start this episode is I want to let you know that I've actually updated my website and expanded my menu of services for chart readings. So if you were to go to my website, which of course is astrolab21.com, on the top menu you'll see the option to book a reading. And if you click on that, of course my website is not super fast, be patient. You'll see that I've got all the various options for chart readings that I offer. And of course, my signature reading is the Blueprint of the Soul reading. It's an in-depth, live 90-minute reading that I do via Zoom. We really take that deep dive into the blueprint of your soul and uncover all of your planets. We do some transits. It's a really thorough investigation. Of course, it's $300. For some people, that's a little steep. So I've added a few other options. One of the most important ones is this Big 3 intro reading. So in this one, I do, your sun, moon, and rising. And it's sort of these essential foundations of the chart. And we discover your genius, your spirit guide, your daemon, as they say in the ancient Greek world. And by doing this as just a 30-minute audio recording, I'm able to offer that one for just $100. So for some people, that might be a great start and a great way of supporting what I'm doing on the channel here, because this is really what I love doing. Reading is fundamental, as they used to say, and it's really fundamental to my practice. I've got some other options too. I've got the solar return reading. Basically, for your birthday every year is a great time to do a solar return chart, sort of set your agenda for the year ahead, what's to come. We look at your transits for the year to come. Great time on your birthday, and also a great birthday gift for folks, friends or family. I have the new soul reading. This is something I really love. It's great for new parents. Again, if you have friends, family, loved ones who just brought a new soul into the world, it's a great gift that you can give them. I do this 45-minute recorded reading for the birth chart of that new soul, and it's so cool and helpful. I think a lot of, especially first-time parents, find this really helpful to get a sense of who this soul is that they've brought into the world, and give them a way of sort of understanding how they can nurture the latent talents that that child is bringing into the world. I've got the Astrology for Teenagers reading, and this one, if you're a parent that has a teenager, or a niece or a nephew or a grandchild, I call this my spiritual guidance counselor reading. And boy, do I wish I had this when I was in high school. But it's sort of a nice, compendium to the traditional sort of guidance counselor session that you would get in high school. And I just think adolescence is tough enough, right? And I think astrology can really help put some things into perspective and help a youngster really discover themselves and their talents and their abilities and get a sense of their direction in life and really understand themselves. It's such a powerful time in our development, and I'm really excited about offering this reading to folks. I also have the first Saturn return reading. If you're in your mid-20s and you're not sure where you're headed or what's going on, great time for a reading, as well as avoiding a midlife crisis reading. So if you just turned 40, could be a good time to check out the charts, because there's some things some cycles that occur during that time in our lives that are really important to get a perspective on. and then the golden years reading. For those of you who maybe have turned in your late 50s, you're about to approach your second Saturn return, right? And retirement is on the horizon. Another fantastic time for a chart reading. So this is a great way to support what I'm trying to do here on the channel. I also have launched a Patreon page, so you can find me at Daljeet Peterson there. I've got 3 basic memberships that I've started. I've got the Mercury, Venus, and Mars membership, but for as little as $1 a month, you can support the work I'm doing here on the channel, which would be great. If you can afford to give more, awesome. There's some different tiers and some incentives that I'm adding that I'll start doing. I'm excited about doing a live monthly video forecast that I'll be doing via Zoom for my Patreon subscribers. And lastly, I signed up for Ko-fi.com, which is a pretty neat thing where you can just buy me a cup of coffee. As you know, this YouTube channel is powered by Nespresso coffee, so I am a coffee addict. So a great way to just support what I'm doing here with a quick $3 donation. So a few ways to support this channel. As I've been saying, you know, this is really what I want to do. I'm hoping to transition to doing astrology full time. It's been a side hustle of mine for years. I've been working professionally in television and media for 25 years, and I'm really committed to porting this over and being full time here. So, you know, a lot of astrologers would keep this series behind a paywall because it really does have a lot of value. In fact, my partner, she keeps telling me that I'm giving away the store here, but I really believe in what I'm doing. I really believe in the idea of crowdfunding. I believe in the sharing economy. I really do think that is the future of where we're headed. So I'm putting this stuff out there. I'm sharing this information, and hopefully if you're finding value in it, hopefully you can find one of those ways to say thank you and support the work I'm doing here. All right. All the housekeeping taken care of, now we can jump into our continuing exploration of the astrological houses. Okay, so here we are, episode 9, and we're going to continue to explore the topic of the houses. You know, in the last episode, we sort of dipped our toe in and we started looking at the relationship of the houses with the signs and how there's an interesting dynamic that plays out between those two principles. We discovered the topic of the ascendant or the rising sign and demonstrated why that is such an important factor in astrology. It really sets the tone for the entire chart. We brought up the example of that new soul that was born on the spring equinox and how a person who could be an Aries sun, but that Aries sun could present itself through 12 different rising signs and appear in 12 different houses and create 12 entirely different personalities. So I'm going to jump back in. We'll do a quick review of just what we did cover in that last episode just to get us back up to speed. You know, we reconstructed our wheel. We brought the zodiac, the signs of the zodiac, into the background so that we could construct the wheel again with our 12 equal houses and went from 1 through 12 around the zodiac in that counterclockwise motion and really started to orient ourselves to this important axis. There's a horizontal axis and a vertical axis within the birth chart that's really important. And the first house and its direction of sunrise is pointing us to the east and pointing us to the ascendant. And it's important to note that, you know, we're learning that astrology is geocentric, which means earth-centered. So what the zodiac, what the horoscope is showing us is, what does it look like when we stand on the earth and look out at the sky? We see the stars and we see the planets and what's going on. And so this geocentricity of astrology is helping us to orient ourselves to the skies, to the heavens. It's as if the earth is not moving and everything else is moving around us. Of course, we know that's not true. We have our heliocentric model of the solar system that tells us otherwise, that actually when we see the planets revolving every day, that's just the Earth revolving on its axis. And when we see the planets slowly creep across the heavens, well, that's their orbits moving around the sun. But what we're interested in, we're here on Earth, and our experience is otherwise, right? We don't feel the Earth rotating, right? We see the sky, things move in the sky, but we have this sense that we are the center of it all. And from a perceptual, phenomenal perspective, that's actually true, right? And that's what astrology is trying to show us. So these 4 points, this major axis of the chart, we've learned that each has a name associated with it: the ascendant or the rising sign at the first house, the descendant on the 7th, the MC, the midheaven, up on the 10th house, and the IC, the nadir, if you will, on the 4th house. And we're learning that each of those is symbolized with these simple 2-letter designations, and these are symbols that we're going to see on birth charts as we start to explore them. So something to familiarize ourselves with. And just a reminder that these 4 points do represent some very specific symbols, if you will. That ascendant we want to think of as our front door. It's the part that we show to the world, where the descendant is the back door, where we let others in. The 10th house, the MC, is the roof. It's our most public place, where people look down and see who we are. It's our reputation in society, as opposed to the IC at the bottom of the chart is our roots. It's our foundation. It's our past. It's our history. So this is a good way to start to orient ourselves to what these 4 primary axes represent. And of course, each of those 4 houses, the 4 houses, 1, 4, 7, and 10, are referred to as angular houses because they're on this axis. They're on this angle. And what we're going to discover is that they do have a special significance, because anytime we have planets that occur or appear in our birth chart in one of these angular houses, they tend to be more emphasized in the personality. They just tend to show up more. And we'll discuss more about why that's so in later episodes. But we just want to start to understand that we have these angular houses. Now, angular houses are similar, but not the same as cardinal signs. You know, you can see how there is this sort of relationship. I don't want to get too bogged down in the differences of those, but just note that they're similar but not the same. So we're looking at this axis, right? And it's all of these houses are on the axis. Now, the second set of houses, houses 2, 5, 8, and 11, are called succedent houses. And of course, they are succeeding the angles. Simple enough. And of course, there's a loose correlation here between succedent houses and fixed signs. But it's just a loose correlation. And again, we'll talk more about those differences as we get deeper into the series. And then the third set of house types, houses 3, 6, 9, and 12, are what are called the cadent houses. And this comes from an idea, there's a Greek word called apoklyma, which means in fall or decline. And so these houses, because they're falling from the position of the angles, they're considered to be in fall or decline or cadent houses. And again, there's some nomenclature about this that will become more apparent as we get deeper into the series. This gets into some 201 level topics that we'll have to save for a later date. But I just want to get these basics out so that we can understand some of these terms, that there are essentially, a set of 3 types of houses. And again, it repeats 4 times around the zodiac. Now, we're really learning to orient ourselves along this axis. We got the horizon and the vertical axis and those 4 cardinal points. But I want to start to break up the wheel in a couple of different ways. And one way is if we just take the horizontal axis, what we see is it cuts the wheel in half and gives us 2 hemispheres. We have a lower hemisphere below this horizon line and the upper hemisphere above the horizon line. And so if we focus just on the lower hemisphere, houses 1 through 6, what we're talking about, I'd like to call this the me cycle. Because what we're going to discover is that all of the things, all the parts of ourselves that we're using that are represented by these 6 houses are focused on me. We use them to focus on ourselves. So we could also say that this is the self hemisphere. And in contrast, all of the houses above the horizon line, houses 7 through 12, I like to think of as the we houses, because these are the parts of ourselves that we use to interact with others. So we could also say that this is the other hemisphere. So just a cool way to start thinking about this 2 sets of houses, right? We have 1 through 6, the me houses, 7 through 12, the we houses, or we could also say self and other. Now, as well as dividing the wheel in half with the horizontal axis, we also, when we add in the vertical axis, we can see that that actually breaks the wheel up into 4 quadrants, each with 1 set of types of houses each. And this is another way I want you to start to think about these houses in terms of the quadrants. So again, if we go back to this bottom hemisphere, which is focused on the self, but just that first quadrant of the first 3 houses, well, all of these houses are going to be related to notions of personal presentation, as we're going to explore in this episode. And then if we move to that second quadrant, we're still in the lower hemisphere, we're still focused on the self, but these houses, 4, 5, and 6, are going to be focused on the basics of life. And then as we move to the upper hemisphere, we get houses 7, 8, and 9. Now we're focused on the other. And these 3 houses focus in a very specific way on the other. They focus on interpersonal issues. And then in the last quadrant, the 4th quadrant, again, still on the upper other hemisphere, we use these 3 houses to deal with extrapersonal issues. And so we have 4 quadrants, 2 hemispheres, a lot going on here as we get into the houses. And again, a lot of information coming at you all at once. Trust, hopefully by now, that we're going to dive deeper into this. We're going to double click on all of these concepts, but this is a really important foundational approach that we need to take in our ability to really understand what's going on with the house system in astrology, because it really is a crucial piece of this puzzle. Because what's going on here is this wheel of the zodiac, represented through these houses, is really showing us a cycle of development that is taking place. From the first house and our very identity, it's really our birth, as we're going to see as we explore the topic of the first house. We start to develop, we start to move from within ourselves, and we start to expand ourselves outward as we discover aspects of ourselves, and then as we start to interact with others. We interact in relationships, we interact in groups, we interact in society, in the workplace, and in social networks. And so there's this really profound encoding inside of the 12 house system that really is one of the foundational pieces of astrology. So I'm presenting all of this. We're sort of front loading some of this information, and again, we're gonna dial in and dig deeper in. So don't feel like you have to memorize it all. Just trust that we're gonna move through it here. So without further ado, let's start our exploration of these houses, and we'll start with the first quadrant. And what we're going to see is that these 3 houses, 1, 2, and 3, they're all dealing with issues of personal presentation, right? We see the first house is dealing with our appearance, the second house deals with possessions, and the third house with communications. And we'll start to associate some keywords with each of these houses too. So here we see to be, to own, and to know. So this makes up the first quadrant. So let's jump in and look at the first house, to be. Okay, first house. And remember, if you recall what we learned when we talked about Aries, the first sign, right? We talked about the key word for Aries is I am. And now we have the first house is to be. So there's a bit of an archetypal symmetry here. similar but not the same. Whereas Aries as a sign represented a quality, now with the first house, it's going to represent a field of experience. So this is where we learn to be. So you can see some of the characteristics associated with the first house. It rules our physical appearance, literally how we appear, our looks, our presentation, our style of dress tends to be indicated by the first house and the sign on the first house, right? So of course it's how we make first impressions on people. When people first meet us, they tend to meet our first house. So if we have planets in the first house, that will really be on display. Whatever sign is on the first house, that will give a quality to how we present ourselves. It really is the persona or mask that we wear. And it really is a really important house because everything else tends to filter through our first house. So our very persona, our presentation style is dictated by the first house. And as we said, it's our symbolic front door, right? It's that part of us we show the world. So the issues of presentation, how do we present? How do we appear? It also rules our physical health in a lot of ways. And of course, health is something, as we'll learn, is indicated by a number of houses and planets and signs, but this is one of the key indicators of physical health, our first house. And each of the houses represents a part of the body, and we kind of are working our way from head to toe around the wheel. So the first house represents the head. Moving on to the second house, whose key word is to own, right? And so this really is the house of possessions. This is all about what we own, what we value. One of the approaches to the second house, which I've always liked, and I get this from Dane Rudyard, the great 20th century astrologer. He often would note that, the first thing we inherit is our body itself, right? From the DNA of our parents, like our body is our first possession in some ways, right? Which we inherit along with, any of our cultural milieu that we're born into, our religious background, our genetic and racial qualities are all inherited in our DNA, in our biology, encoded into our bodies. So it's always it's a much deeper appreciation of one of the meanings of the second house. It's not one that we often get in the more superficial or cookbook definitions of the second house, but I've always found that really helpful to see that quality in the second house because it is a very physical, embodied house in a lot of ways. So you think of inherited as well as acquired possessions. It's our house of resources. It's all the things that we gather to ourselves in order to empower ourselves. So of course money comes under this house, food, which is not only important for our very survival, it's something that we enjoy, that we indulge in. So I always like to say, whether you eat to live or you live to eat, you're using your second house to do either, because that's related to food as a resource and food as a source of pleasure. So money is always going to come under the auspices of the second house, but really value and values, right? Because if you think about it, what does money represent? Well, it's a form of exchange of value. It's how we acquire the resources and the possessions that we most value, that we want to have, that gives us a sense of comfort, of power, of strength, of enjoyment, of pleasure. So always think about, this is really on a broader scale, all about what we value. And as we look at the anatomy, the second house tends to rule the face. And of course, I just want to talk about, we said how this is a developmental cycle, right? And if you think about the second house, think about a toddler when it first learns a key word, mine, right? You ever see kids who's like, mine, mine, mine? They just want to grab and possess and own anything, right? This is that child starting to really use their second house. This idea of possessions that I can hold, that I can grab, that I can bring things to me, and that they have power. Mine. So, interesting thing to consider when we think about the second house. So the third house, we get the key word is to know. And this is really our house of communication. This is how we learn, how we assimilate information, right? It tends to be associated with most of our left brain activities, right? Reasoning and logic and mathematics and problem solving, right? Those are all very third house activities. It's associated with memory, the process, the mental process of memorizing things. Of course, this is all stuff we start to learn, again, when you see a child, they have that moment where all of a sudden they have that explosion of language, right? They might have a couple of words, they know mama and dada and baba, whatever, and then all of a sudden, within a few weeks, this explosion of language occurs and they get it. That's them discovering their third house, their house of communication. And of course, this is a house we use in our early foundational education as we learn to read and write and do our basic multiplication tables. The third house rules siblings, because of course siblings are a big part of our early childhood environment. They are a way that we assimilate and learn. We learn a lot from our older siblings and even our younger siblings, right? And in general, the third house is our immediate environment. It rules our immediate environment, right? Which is why it's also considered to rule our neighborhood, as well as short journeys. These are all things that are ruled by the third house. It's also our house where we do, it controls or rules our like fine motor skills. And again, at that same time when we have that explosion of language as a young child, it also seems to be coincident with a time when we start to really refine our motor skills, right? We can throw and catch things, we can hop and skip and jump, right? We're starting to really coordinate and use our body a little easier, which is why it's connected with the hands and the arms and the nervous system, right? Our fine motor skills are refined and controlled by the third house. So obviously the sign on the third house, any planets in that house are going to impact how we learn, how we know, how we communicate, how we express ourselves, which we'll get into as we start to put all these pieces together. But this is a foundation that we're starting to really understand, is what these houses actually represent. Now, that concludes the first quadrant, and when we get to the fourth house, we are moving into the second quadrant, where we're going to explore the basics of life, right? Which is the fourth house of home, the fifth house of creativity, and the sixth house of work. And again, we're repeating a cycle here, where we had a angular, succedent, and cadent house in that first quadrant. Well, now that pattern repeats. So as we move to the fourth house, we are going to explore the second of our angular houses. And remember, this points down to the IC, the coeli, right? We talk about this being the roots, the foundation, the basement of the chart. And as we'll see, of course, it represents home. So let's look at the qualities and characteristics of that fourth house. Here we have the key word is to establish, right? We're establishing a firm foundation in ourselves. So the fourth house rules things like home, our roots, our foundations, right? It's all about security. It's where we're learning to become emotionally secure within ourselves. It's really associated with basically the formation of our ego consciousness, right? And in childhood development and developmental psychology, we notice that this occurs right around the age of 7, which of course also coincides with the first quarter Saturn square, which is no coincidence, and that's something we'll talk about again in further episodes. But what's happening here in the fourth house is we're establishing a real concrete sense of self. We're getting rooted in our ego consciousness. We are a distinct person. We are an entity, and we exist. We have a boundary. We are a container for all of the things so far that we've learned about ourselves, about our possessions, about how we communicate. It all starts to get consolidated in this fourth house. So it provides this sense of an emotional stability, right? And if you think about the archetypal connection of the fourth house with the fourth sign of Cancer, And with its ruler, the moon, you start to get a sense of what this archetypal complex of the fourth house is all about. It's connected with the past. It's connected with ancestors, right? It's also connected mostly with the mother, or at least whatever parent was the more nurturing of the two, which traditionally has been the mother, but sometimes it's the father. It's not explicit, and it's one of the interesting ongoing debates about the fourth and the 10th house axis, which again, maybe we'll explore in our 200 level series. But for now, let's associate it with the mother, and more generally with the sense of the matriarchy, with the maternal, with the nurturing side of life, where we go to nurture ourselves, spiritually, physically, mentally, emotionally, or otherwise. We turn to our fourth house, right? And this is a very private part of ourselves. Remember, it's the basement, it's the cellar, it's the foundation, it's the roots. And if we think about anatomically, the fourth house is said to rule the chest. Okay, fifth house. Now we're moving to a succeedent house. The fifth house with the keyword is to release. Of course, what are we releasing? Well, we're releasing creativity, self-expression. This is the creative release of our impulse to be expressive, to be creative, okay? The fifth house is the house of the actor, of the artist, of the musician, of anyone or any way of being expressive, right? It's the house of fun and games. It's the house of pleasure and joy, right? Which is why it's also the house of children, because this is the house where we actually make babies, right? We talk about it being the house of romance and love affairs, right? This is that part of ourselves that we take out on a date. It's the part of ourselves that pursues someone in a courtship. It's the part of ourselves that writes love poems, right? This is the romantic in us all. We all have this part of ourselves. So it also rules the notion of our inner child, right? That part of us that is endlessly curious and creative and motivated to learn and to grow in a very innocent sort of way. That's our fifth house too. Rules speculation and gambling traditionally, and also spiritual techniques, because it's ruled by the sun and that connection with Leo. There's a sense of pursuing our spiritual sense of destiny, right? Of course, the fifth house is what we would call in Vedic astrology one of the Dharma houses, the house of action, right? The first and the fifth, as well as the ninth, are all what we would call Dharma houses, as we'll learn. Well, again, we'll discuss more of that in later episodes. But anatomically, it rules the solar plexus. Of course, fifth house, Leo, sun, no surprise that it would rule the solar plexus, which is really our center of creative power, right? Then we come to the sixth house, whose key word is to improve. And this is the house of work, of service, of duty. It's the house of our vocation, of our calling, house of well-being and health. It rules our short-term illnesses, enemies, rivals, and legal troubles, employees, servants, and helpers. Now, I just want to mention something about the sixth house, because it's a really key, what we call a transitional archetype. Because as you can see, it's the last house that exists below the horizon. It's the last of the me focus, the focus on the self of these houses below the horizon. So what we're doing with the sixth house is we're attempting to make that move above the horizon, to move from the self and out into the world and into relationships with the others. And that part of ourselves we use with that second set, the second hemisphere of houses. So the sixth house archetype is really, really important, and it's between the fifth and the seventh, and it's something worth exploring, because if we just discussed how that fifth house is our creativity, it's our self-expression, it's where we feel like we're on top of the world and we can do anything. But what we often discover early on is that some of our ideas tend to fall short, right? We're not as creative, we're not as talented as we thought we were. And we're met with a sense of humility, a sense of disappointment. There's a sort of fall from grace. And we fall literally into our sixth house from the fifth. And the sixth house is where we realize, we actually aren't as talented as we thought. We might need to learn more. We might need to try harder. We might need to improve ourselves. And what happens when we do that is that we seek out teachers, we seek out mentors, we seek out gurus who have already gone through the entire cycle of life and have something to offer that we lack, that we need, right? And so we endeavor to study with a master craftsman. We become an apprentice, right? We learn a craft, we learn a trade, we study a spiritual practice. And so that we can acquire those skills ourselves, so that we can improve, that we can learn, right? And then once we become skilled, well, then we are able to then, it's the student who becomes the teacher, right? These are all sixth house things. So if you think about sixth house and Mercury and Virgo and that sort of archetypal complex, you start to get a sense of what the sixth house is all about. So there we have it. We have the first six houses, the first hemisphere, the first two quadrants. We've established the me side of the wheel, and we're ready to go out into the world and explore through our second set of houses. And I want to stop this video there because I want to break this up into two parts. So in the next video, we'll explore the second hemisphere, the other, right? The we side of the wheel. And we'll see how houses 7 through 12 are the aspects of ourselves that we use socially. As we said, third quadrant is interpersonal, and the fourth quadrant will be extrapersonal issues. And so by the time we get through the whole wheel, we'll have really explored all these 12 facets of the self, the sides of the personality that we all have, and we all have the power to utilize and to grow and expand and evolve through. So, all right, that's it for this episode. Hopefully more of the information and excitement about the houses is starting to percolate up for you. You're starting to maybe think about your own six houses and how you use those parts of yourself. So we'll pivot and we'll move to the next set in the next episode. All right, till then, Sat Nam, everyone.